Imagine you're standing outside a Stone Age camp about 20,000 years ago. There are no houses, no fences, no streetlights, just a few fires, sleeping humans, animal bones scattered across the ground, and somewhere beyond the firelight, a wolf is watching. It could leave. It could attack. Instead, it waits. And that tiny decision may have started one of the strangest relationships in the history of life. Because humans did not simply capture wolves and turn them into dogs. The truth is much stranger. In a very real sense, the first dogs may have walked into our lives on their own. And once you understand why, the modern dog suddenly makes a lot more sense. From the Labrador staring at your dinner, to the Chihuahua convinced it's capable of fighting a bear. So let's go back to the Ice Age and find out how a wild predator became man's best friend. The wolf that didn't run. For most of human history, wolves were competitors. They hunted many of the same animals humans hunted. They were dangerous, they were intelligent, and they had absolutely no reason to trust us. But humans had something wolves couldn't ignore: food. Hunter-gatherers routinely left behind bones, scraps, organs, and other edible remains. To a hungry wolf, a human camp could become an irresistible feeding opportunity. But there was a problem. Getting close to humans was dangerous. So imagine a population of wolves living around these camps. One wolf is extremely aggressive. It panics whenever humans appear. Another is slightly less nervous. A third is unusually curious. That third wolf doesn't need to become friendly. It only needs to be less afraid than the others. It approaches the staff. It eats some scraps. It survives. Eventually, it has puppies. And if some of those puppies inherit its lower fear response, they are more likely to approach humans too. Generation after generation, the wolves most comfortable around people gain access to a food source that their more fearful relatives avoid. Nobody has to sit down and say, "Let's invent dogs." Natural selection can do the work automatically. This idea is often called the commensal or self-domestication pathway. Animals exploit resources created by humans, and over many generations, selection favors individuals better adapted to living around us. But here's where the story gets complicated. We don't actually know that this is exactly how dogs began. Scientists still debate the precise mechanism, location, and timing of domestication. Ancient DNA has dramatically changed the picture, and researchers continue to find evidence that makes the story more complicated than the simple "wolf eats scraps" narrative. What we do know is remarkable. Dogs descend from ancient wolf populations, and the first clear archaeological dogs appear at least around 14,000 years ago. Genetic evidence suggests the domestication process itself may have begun substantially earlier, potentially somewhere between roughly 20,000 and 40,000 years ago. So we're not looking for one magical night. We're looking for a long evolutionary relationship. Then something weird happened. Here's the part that makes dog domestication so fascinating. When animals become domesticated, they often start changing in ways that humans didn't directly ask for. Smaller skulls, different coat patterns, changes in regeneration, reduced aggression, sometimes even floppy ears and shorter faces. Why? One famous clue came from an extraordinary experiment in the Soviet Union. In the 1950s, geneticist Dmitry Belyaev began selectively breeding silver foxes. But he wasn't selecting for beautiful fur. He wasn't selecting for intelligence. He wasn't even trying to make foxes look like dogs. He selected primarily for one thing: how comfortable the foxes were around humans. The calmest animals were bred. Their offspring were tested. The calmest offspring were bred again. And after generations of selection, the foxes began displaying not just dramatically reduced fear and aggression, but a collection of physical and behavioral changes associated with domestication. This experiment became a major piece of evidence in the study of what's often called domestication syndrome, the tendency for certain behavioral and developmental changes to appear together during domestication. And that gives us a completely different way to think about the first dogs. Humans didn't necessarily need to teach wolves to be dogs. They may have simply created an environment where the wolves most comfortable around humans had an advantage. Then evolution started doing something humans are very good at, turning tiny differences into enormous changes.
But humans had a role too.
Here's an important correction to the idea that wolves simply domesticated themselves. They didn't do it alone. At some point, humans also began making choices. Maybe one wolf was particularly useful at detecting danger. Maybe another was good at following a scent. Maybe another tolerated children. Humans could feed those animals, protect them, keep them nearby, eventually deliberately breed them. And now natural selection was being joined by human selection. That's when things could accelerate. A wolf that merely tolerated humans could become an animal actively cooperating with humans, a hunting partner, a warning system, a camp guardian, a companion, and eventually, something that didn't resemble its wild ancestor very much at all. The relationship became mutual. Humans provided food and protection. Dogs provided senses, cooperation, warning, hunting assistance, and eventually, something even more powerful: companionship. The biggest mystery isn't when, it's where. And this is where the scientific story gets fascinating. For years, researchers argued over whether dogs originated in East Asia, Europe, the Middle East, or somewhere else in Eurasia. Different studies have produced different answers. Some ancient DNA research has even suggested complicated scenarios involving more than one ancestral population. More recent genomic work on ancient wolves points toward Eastern Eurasia as especially important to the ancestry of dogs, while other ancient dog evidence shows that early European dogs were already genetically connected to later dog populations. In other words, there is still no universally accepted single birthplace of the dog. And that's not a failure of science. It's what happens when you're trying to reconstruct an event that began tens of thousands of years ago from bones, genomes, and fragments of ancient history. The wolves involved are mostly gone. Some ancient dog lineages disappeared. Modern dogs experienced migrations and mixing, and wolves and dogs continued exchanging genes. The family tree isn't a neat straight line. It's more like a tangled forest. Then humans went completely overboard. Once humans had dogs, something extraordinary happened. We discovered that dogs could be changed. Fast. Different dogs could be selected for different abilities. Some became specialized hunters. Some tracked. Some guarded. Some pulled loads. Some helped control livestock. Others were selected almost entirely for appearance or companionship. And eventually, humans began producing an absurd range of body shapes. A greyhound looks almost nothing like a dachshund. A Great Dane looks almost nothing like a Pomeranian. Yet they're all members of the domestic dog lineage. Modern dog breeds, however, are much younger than dogs themselves. Most recognizable modern breeds were standardized during the last few centuries, especially during the 19th century explosion of organized breeding. So when you look at a modern dog, you're seeing multiple layers of history. First came the ancient wolf, then thousands of years of adaptation to humans, then thousands more years of human selection, and finally, centuries of intense breed making. The Chihuahua wasn't created overnight. It is the end result of an evolutionary experiment that began when humans and wolf ancestors first started tolerating each other's presence. And then the relationship became emotional. Some of the most powerful evidence for this relationship isn't genetic, it's archaeological. Ancient humans sometimes buried dogs alongside people. One famous example is the roughly 14,700-year-old Bonn-Oberkassel burial in Germany, where a dog was buried with humans. That tells us something numbers can't. At least some ancient people weren't keeping dogs merely because they were useful. They cared about them. They invested time in them. They mourned them. And that changes the story completely. Because domestication wasn't simply humans turning a predator into a tool, it became a relationship. And that relationship eventually changed both sides. Dogs became extraordinarily good at reading human behavior. They can respond to human gestures, attention, facial expressions, and social cues in ways that are unusual among animals. Humans, meanwhile, became exceptionally sensitive to dog behavior. We interpret their faces. We respond to their sounds. We even experience hormonal changes during positive interactions with our dogs. The result is something evolution rarely produces: two different species becoming extraordinarily good at understanding each other. The real twist. So here's the part I find most incredible. We usually imagine domestication as a human invention. Humans capture an animal, humans control it, humans breed it, humans change it. But the dog story doesn't fit that model perfectly. The earliest stage may have begun with wolves exploiting the human environment. The wolves changed. Then humans changed their behavior toward those wolves. Then humans began selecting them. Then the dogs changed us right back. And eventually, one of the most dangerous predators in Eurasia became an animal that waits outside the bathroom, because apparently, being alone for 11 seconds is emotionally devastating. That's not just domestication. That's co-evolution. We didn't simply create dogs. We created an environment in which a certain kind of wolf could thrive. And those wolves, in turn, became creatures extraordinarily well adapted to us. The first dog may not have been born when a human captured a wolf. It may have been born when a wolf looked at a human camp and made a different calculation. Maybe I should stay. Tens of thousands of years later, that decision is still sitting at your feet. And that's the truly strange thing about dogs. When your dog looks at you, you're not just looking at a domesticated animal. You're looking at the surviving result of one of the longest partnerships in human history. A partnership that began before cities, before agriculture, before writing, before civilization as we know it, before we even understood what a pet was. The dog didn't just enter human history. In a very real sense, the dog helped write it. If you enjoyed this kind of deep dive into the hidden stories behind everyday things, subscribe, because the next time you look at an ordinary animal, there may be an extraordinary evolutionary story hiding underneath it.